Picture a folder sitting on a desk. Inside it, 3 years of tax returns, a customer list, and a single owner's name that's been signing every invoice for the last 20 years. That folder represents a real business, generating real cash flow, and the person who built it is quietly trying to figure out what happens to it after they're gone from behind the counter. Here's the tension almost nobody explains clearly. Thousands of these folders exist across the country right now, sitting on desks belonging to owners who are approaching retirement with no real plan for what comes next. And on the other side of that same table, there's a growing number of people trying to buy exactly this kind of business, using financing structures most people have never heard of. Very few of these deals actually close, and the reason isn't a lack of interested buyers or a lack of good businesses. It's a lack of understanding, on both sides, of the actual mechanism that connects them. This video walks through that mechanism, level by level, from a single searcher with modest savings, all the way up to a holding company controlling businesses worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Every number in this video comes from a real, checkable source: SBA lending terms, published mergers and acquisitions data, standard valuation practice. None of it is hype, and none of it requires you to already be wealthy. What it requires is understanding a model that's been quietly running in the background of the American economy for decades. One honest note before we go further. This is an educational breakdown of a real financing and acquisition model, not investment, legal, or financial advice. Acquisition debt of the kind we're about to discuss carries real personal risk, including personal guarantees and liens against your own assets, and individual outcomes vary enormously by deal, industry, and market condition. Every number that follows can stand on its own without needing this disclaimer to prop it up. Level 1 begins here. Level 1, searching. This is the phase where the entire model either works or quietly dies, and it starts with one number: seller's discretionary earnings, often shortened to SDE. Inside this box is what SDE actually measures: the total financial benefit a single full-time owner-operator gets from the business in a year, not just the profit on paper, but profit plus the owner's own salary, plus a set of add-backs, expenses that technically ran through the business but wouldn't exist under new ownership. Owner salary normalization is the biggest of these, since the current owner might pay themselves an unusually low or unusually high number for tax reasons that have nothing to do with the business's real earning power. A personal vehicle or personal travel run through the company books is another common add-back. A one-time legal expense from a lawsuit that's already settled is another. Strip all of these out, and what's left is SDE, the real number a buyer is actually purchasing. Here's where the pricing conversation starts. Main Street businesses, generally smaller operations with a single owner deeply embedded in daily operations, tend to trade at somewhere around 3 to 4 times SDE, based on published market data tracked by organizations that follow business sale transactions closely. Compare that multiple to what happens once a business's earnings, measured differently at that scale as EBITDA, cross into the lower middle market. There, multiples commonly run 5 to 8 times or higher. Notice the gap between these two ranges. That gap, and the reason it exists, is going to become the single most important idea in this entire video, several levels from now. Most searches at this stage don't die because a buyer can't find a business for sale. They die on customer concentration, a business where one client represents a large share of total revenue, which makes lenders and buyers alike nervous about what happens to that revenue the moment ownership changes hands. A proprietary search, contacting owners directly rather than only reviewing what a broker has listed publicly, tends to surface healthier businesses precisely because they were never desperate enough to need a broker's help selling in the first place. Level 2 begins here, financing, the stage where most people assume this entire model requires wealth it actually doesn't require, but does require real capital and real personal risk. The backbone of small business acquisition financing in the United States runs through the Small Business Administration's 7A loan program. Under SBA's own published terms, an individual loan through this program can go up to $5 million. On the guarantee side, the SBA backs 75% of loan amounts above $150,000, and 85% of amounts below that threshold, which is what makes lenders willing to finance a deal that would otherwise look too risky to carry alone. Here's the clause nobody warns you about clearly enough. Anyone who owns 20% or more of the business is required to sign a personal guarantee, meaning your own personal assets stand behind this loan if the business can't service its own debt. Compare two ways a buyer might cover the equity injection required alongside that SBA loan. On one side, cash out of pocket. On the other side, a standby seller note, where the seller agrees to finance a portion of the purchase price themselves, with principal and interest payments deferred for a set period. Under SBA rules, that standby note can actually count toward the required equity injection, but only when it's structured with that deferral built in, which is a real structural mechanic, not a negotiating trick. Before any of this financing closes, a quality of earnings review sits underneath the whole deal like a foundation inspection. This is an independent, detailed look at whether the SDE number from level 1 actually holds up once someone outside the deal examines the books closely. Alongside it sits the working capital peg, a negotiated line item determining how much cash and inventory need to remain inside the business at closing so the new owner isn't handed an empty shell. These two items, quality of earnings and the working capital peg, are the two most common deal killers in small business acquisitions. More often than price itself, level 3 begins here, operating, the plateau most searchers never see coming until they're standing inside it. The moment financing closes, a new number takes over the buyer's entire attention: debt service coverage ratio. Inside this box is exactly what that ratio measures: cash flow available for debt service, divided by total debt service owed for the period. Lenders generally want to see this ratio comfortably above 1, often citing a comfort range somewhere around 1.15 to 1.25, though the exact number any individual lender requires varies deal to deal. Here's the operational reality nobody puts in the pitch. On day 1, nobody looks at the new owner with any goodwill they haven't earned yet. Employees who worked for the previous owner for 15 years are watching closely to see whether this new person actually understands the business or is simply extracting value from it. Customers who trusted the old owner's handshake are watching just as closely. This is the stage where the personal guarantee from level 2 stops being an abstract clause on a document and starts feeling like exactly what it is: real personal exposure tied to whether this specific business keeps performing. Many single business owners hit a plateau right here. The business stabilizes, debt service gets covered, and growth flattens out, because a single owner-operator has a hard ceiling on how much personal attention one person can give one business. That plateau is precisely the tension that pushes some operators toward level 4 instead of staying content running one solid, profitable company forever. If you've made it this far and you're the kind of person who actually wants to understand these mechanisms rather than just the highlight reel, subscribing helps this reach more people who think the same way. Level 4 begins here, acquiring, and this is the intellectual centerpiece of the entire video: multiple arbitrage. Picture a single business generating $1 million in EBITDA, priced on its own, at a Main Street-style multiple, somewhere around 3 to 4 times that number. Now picture that same $1 million in EBITDA folded into a larger platform, one that already has $5 million in combined EBITDA across several acquired businesses. Follow this line upward. The combined platform, precisely because it's larger, more diversified, and less dependent on any single owner's daily involvement, tends to command a materially higher multiple, often landing in that 5 to 8 times range or beyond, the same lower middle market range we set up back in level 1. Here's the mechanism in plain terms. The exact same $1 million of earnings is now worth more, purely because of what it sits inside. Nothing about the underlying business changed. What changed is scale, management depth, and the reduced risk that comes from earnings no longer depending on one irreplaceable person behind the counter. This is standard private equity roll-up theory, not a secret insight invented for this video, and it's the real engine behind why a group of small, unglamorous businesses, HVAC companies, plumbing outfits, a filter manufacturer, can be worth dramatically more together than any of them were worth apart. Of course, this comes with a cost that compounds right alongside the value. Each new acquisition often carries its own layer of debt and its own personal guarantee, stacking directly on top of the guarantees from earlier deals. The same structural feature that builds the platform's value also builds the operator's personal risk exposure, level by level, deal by deal. Level 5 begins here, building, the stage where the collection of businesses becomes something structurally different, a holding company. At this level, a management fee structure typically emerges, where the holding company charges each individual business a fee for centralized services, accounting, HR, purchasing power, in exchange for the operating leverage that scale provides. Alongside this, dividend recapitalization becomes available as a tool, where a business that's been paid down significantly can be refinanced, pulling cash out for the owner without ever selling the underlying asset. This is a standard, well-documented mechanic in private equity, not a workaround. Here's the real strategic fork every roll-up operator eventually faces. Compare these two paths side by side. On the left, sell the entire platform to a private equity firm, cashing out the multiple arbitrage built over years of acquisitions in a single transaction. On the right, hold the platform and continue compounding cash flow and dividend recaps indefinitely, never selling at all. Home services and trades roll-up specifically have become a real, publicly reported area of interest for major private equity firms in recent years, though any specific deal multiple involved in those transactions should be treated as approximate rather than precisely known from the outside. This fork matters because it exposes something worth addressing directly rather than dodging. A common objection to this entire model is that it's simply private equity extracting small businesses for parts. That criticism deserves an honest answer, not a dismissal. The answer lives in that same fork. Some capital in this space genuinely operates on a fund timeline, meaning it must exit within a set number of years regardless of what's best for the underlying business, because the fund itself has a defined life. Other capital, sometimes called permanent capital, has no such clock, and can choose to hold and compound indefinitely. Which type of capital sits behind any specific roll-up materially changes what actually happens to the businesses and the people inside them. Level 6 begins here, the macro close, and the piece that ties every level back together. There is a real, well-documented pattern of small business owners approaching retirement age without a formal succession plan in place, tracked by organizations that study business transitions closely. This should be understood as an industry-estimated pattern playing out over decades, not a single precise ratio, and definitely not a countdown clock demanding urgent action this week. It's a slow, structural shift in who owns and operates the physical, unglamorous backbone of the American economy, the trades, the local manufacturers, the service companies that don't show up in a stock index but keep entire towns running. This entire 6-level climb, searcher to buyer to operator to acquirer to builder to holding company, is a documented, named strategy in the business world. It isn't a secret nobody knows about. What makes it credible is precisely that it's precedent, taught in business schools, financed by a federal lending program with public terms, and tracked by organizations that publish real transaction data every quarter. But close this out honestly, without moralizing. What this climb costs the seller side deserves to be said plainly. An owner who built a business over 20 or 30 years is often navigating a decision shaped less by price and more by what happens to their name, their employees, and their legacy the day they hand over the keys. Understanding that isn't a footnote to this model. It's the other half of the same folder we opened this video with. If this gave you a clearer picture of how ownership actually changes hands in this country, there's another piece of this story worth telling, how family offices and private equity-backed roll-ups are professionalizing this exact model at a scale most people never see.